keep me going. We got a lot to cover, always. My wife's not here, so she's in the other class. I said, honey, what? No, I'm just kidding. She's over there in the sanctuary. So we are, Rick, he leaves town and leaves me this easy chapter on marriage to go through. It's like, come on, Rick, could you pick another weekend to go? No, I'm just kidding. So today we're going to look at chapter 7, verses 1 through 16. It's kind of like part 1. The whole chapter has to do with, this is a marriage, divorce, and singleness, as Paul is instructing the Corinthian church. And we're going to see, last week Rick was covering some very significant things about how their behavior is significant with respect to their relationship with God. We want to get into some cultural issues today. He's been doing that. You need to understand their context and why they were doing what they were doing. And I hope you'll see that as we get through these first few verses of chapter 16. So let's just go ahead and dive in there and press on with his teaching on marriage. And we're just going to go through your notes. I have some questions designed in them, so we'll get to those. But in this chapter, Paul responds to written correspondence. He's been interacting with them, but they had written him a previous letter with some issues they were talking to him about, or giving them their thoughts and implying that they wanted his thoughts. But sometimes their thoughts were not humble, what do you think, Paul? It was more like, this is what we believe. Can you confirm that type of thing? So we'll see that. So he's responding, and we'll see in verse 1, to some written correspondence that came from them concerning a number of items. This is the first item that he mentions from that. So here in this chapter, he instructs them with respect to marriage and the marriage relationship, with a focus on sexual intimacy within marriage, the issue of divorce, and also a proper perspective on being single. All these things were part of what they were trying to think through, and here's what I really want you to think through or be aware of. Paul deals with a practice, their practice, which promoted, I think, a false sense of spiritual maturity, and we want to get our arms around that. His greatest concern for the Corinthian church, not only here, but and we're going to see it here, was genuine spiritual maturity. Because they had some wrong ideas about what it meant to be mature spiritually. But his greatest concern is for this genuine spiritual maturity that had Christ as the center focus. Remember how you've already talked about they had these, divisions, or they were following certain people and that type of thing. And he wants them to truly focus on Christ. And then a Christ-likeness that resulted from, we're going to see in this chapter, an eternal perspective in verses 29 and 31 of 7, and an ever-deepening, undistracted devotion to Christ. That's in 7:35. So we want to get our arms around what's driving Paul and how he deals with these people. Okay? So, and as we go, if you have questions, feel free to ask, and then I'll write them down and give them to Rick. He stuck me with this chapter. I'm going to pass it to him. No, I'm just kidding. Verses 1 through 5. Sexual abstinence not permitted in marriage. That's what Paul's going to do. So, here we have verse 1. And you'll see. Notice now concerning, he says, the things about which you wrote to me. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. So right off the bat, he responds to this issue raised by the Corinthians when they wrote to him. And there are two ways, maybe you have not had this come up, in which the idea, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, there are two ways in which that can be understood. Okay? First, the phrase could be a direct statement by Paul giving them instruction about his perspective on abstinence in general. Just a direct statement. It's good for a man not to touch a woman. And by the way, not to touch a woman was a euphemism in their culture for sexual relations, okay? And you can see that like in Genesis 20, verse 6. Then God said to him in a dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. Furthermore, it is I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her, Sarah, when she was taken out of. I did not let you touch her. Proverbs 6:29. So is he who sleeps with his neighbor's wife. No one who touches her will go unpunished. That's the idea of, adultery, but that's the euphemism. So that's what we're talking about, sexual relations. So that's the first view. The second view understands the phrase to be a direct quote from the Corinthian letter, giving their perspective to Paul. Which he repeats. He repeats the line from their letter to set forth the issue before he corrects a misconception in their thinking. Okay? A number of interpreters take this view, and let me give you some of the reasons. And I tend to agree with this. Okay, but let's think about it. Maybe you haven't had that come up, but and so let's look at some of the reasons. Okay, there are 3 reasons, and see what you think. And first, the phrase peride, that's the Greek, which says now concerning, appears 5 other times in the letter. I give you the references. And in each instance, it alerts the listener to that one topic has ended and a new one is taken up. And often often they would do that when they're quoting something or trying to set the stage. So, Garland says, it's reasonable to regard the peride, or the now concerning formula, as introducing a direct quotation or paraphrase from summing up the Corinthians letter that serves as a subject heading for the section that he's going to talk about, sexual asceticism in marriage, okay? So there's a structural marker here that may truly imply that. Second, and this is significant, other texts make it clear that Paul did not hold this kind of view. It's good for a man not to touch a woman himself. For example, in later letters, he expressly condemns asceticism. Colossians 2:20 and 21, 1 Timothy 4:3. Let me just read those first, where he says this. He says, if with Christ you died to the elemental principles of the universe, why do you live as if you still belong to the world? Why do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Kind of a legalistic approach to things. 1 Timothy 4:3, the false teachers, they forbid marriage and demand abstinence from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. So this idea of the marriage relationship, he wasn't like this. In fact, remember Ephesians chapter 5? Such a high view of marriage and how it reflects the reality of the relationship between Christ and his bride, the church, this marvelous view of marriage. So the argument would be that he didn't hold to that kind of view. He wouldn't have said that as a direct statement of his perspective. And he adds this, not only so, but in light of his Jewish heritage, the idea that marriage might be thought of as sin, and you can see that in the chapter. We're going to get to this next week, but in verse 28, if you marry, you have not sinned. And so this is their perspective because of some reasons we're going to talk about. He would never have lined up with that. Or 36, if any man thinks he is acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, if she is past her youth, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let her marry. Okay, so these kinds of things imply that it doesn't make any as much sense for him to be making that statement to them just as a matter of his perspective on it. Okay, this would not be Paul's sentiment, if that makes sense to you. Okay, and let me give you some cultural context in the Corinthian church. That's what's on page 2 here, and see if this helps also. And I think this is really significant, how they were viewing this idea of not having that kind of intimacy even in marriage. It's good for a man not to touch a woman. And here, this came out of I think Garland's commentary, and there's more than just these 3. There were a number of reasons that could have contributed to this kind of perspective. First, repudiation of the licentiousness of the culture. We know the kind of culture Corinth was. Rick covered that in the introductory lecture about this melting pot of, in their culture, a lot of sin and depravity and practices that were ungodly. As those taught by the Spirit, the Corinthian Christians may have wanted to distance themselves from the vulgar expressions of sexuality in their culture. And here's the key. And they overreacted against the debauchery that beset urban environments such as Corinth by completely renouncing sexual relations. There's an implication here. We're going to talk about some implications, but sin is sin, and the culture has sinful practices and things, and we want to be biblical as we respond to the culture, but you don't want to overreact and set down something that isn't driven biblically to deal with the culture, because that can get you in trouble. We're going to see how that gets them in trouble. And especially if the overreaction is equated by them to a higher level of spiritual maturity. Okay, we're going to talk about that. So that's one thought. Secondly, this idea of a Gnostic dualism. How are we doing? A dualistic view of body and spirit may have persuaded them to conclude, since we are filled with the Spirit, we must accordingly abandon the things of the flesh and give up sex, including marital sex, the most obvious manifestation of the fleshly lower nature. Those who indulge their sexual urges are still fleshly. That's the Greek word sarkikoi. And pollute their spiritual nature. You can see kind of what's going on. And if this is interesting. If they were aware of the teaching of the Lord, let's just take this, Matthew 19:12, where Jesus said, "For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can." That's weighty from the Lord. Luke 20:34 through 36. Jesus said to them, "Those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage." And we're going to see how that comes in the next one, this over-realized eschatology idea, which Rick mentioned in his introduction. Indeed, they cannot die anymore because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. Okay? So when you couple those kind of comments from Christ, and here it filtered through a world-denying hermeneutic. So if you have that presupposition, if you're thinking along those lines, and hey, this is more spiritual, and look, Jesus even backs it up, it may have fueled this glorification of celibacy. And there's an implication here for us. Your presuppositions or your ideas that you bring to a text, if you don't keep texts in their context and see the flow of thought, you can run with something and use it to fuel bad ideas or bad practice, or which is what they're doing, in a sense. We don't want to do that, do we? You know, we can't do that. That's why the Word of God, handled well, is our objectivity, because we all sit under its authority, and we need to adjust what we think to a proper hermeneutic applied to the text, so we know, hey, this is what God says, and we have rules to do that, right? Hermeneutical principles that we bring that are God-given. We don't make them up. We use them to, okay, every jot and tittle is inspired. We want to handle it right and know what it says so we can do it right. And then a third idea, over-realized eschatology. We just read what the Lord said about where we're headed and how it's going to be. The Corinthians emphasized the already and underplayed the not yet, and believed that as Christians, they were already experiencing a post-resurrection experience, kind of, when marriage would cease. Okay? And there's some text you can, Mark 12. Again, same kind of thing we just read, Mark 12, 24 through 25. Jesus said to them, "Is not this the reason you are wrong, that you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." Okay, they've got that text. They've got Luke, again, chapter 20. "Those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered," we just read that, same idea. Hey, we're part of that age. You get the point. So if that's where they're at, marriage belongs to this age, which is passing away. And sexual abstinence was regarded by some as a way to step out of this world and to step up to God, to be more spiritually mature. Not only were they speaking in the tongues of angels, remember, Paul deals with that. Chapter 13, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, we've arrived. But also by renouncing marriage and conjugal relations, they were living like angels already. See, because we're not going to be like that. One commentator, Bargy, he quotes, "From a theological perspective, they must have claimed that their sexual freedom and their freedom from sexuality, as well as their public prophecies, their ecstatic gifts, were all signs and confirmations that they had already been called by God to an exalted and perfected existence." Paul tries to reel in these exalted Christians from their spiritual stratosphere and reacquaint them with realities of earth. And I would say also to bring them back in line with truth. Okay, they're using truth, but they're misusing truth. Does that make sense? Okay. So, I think V's comment here is really kind of cool. Same idea. Here's another expression of their spirituality, quote, "with its negative attitude toward the material world and the body." In such a case, their position would have gone something like this, as they're setting, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. They're telling Paul that's what they believe. "Since you yourself are unmarried, Paul, and are not actively seeking marriage, and since you have denied porneia," that's sexual perversion and sin, "in your letter to us, is it not so that one is better off not to have sexual intercourse at all? After all, in the new age, which we have already entered by the Spirit, there is neither marrying nor giving in marriage. Why should we not be as the angels now? Besides, since the body counts for nothing," this is that Gnostic dualism idea, "if some wish to fulfill physical needs, there are always the prostitutes." And that's okay. If you spirit and body. So here you have both denial for higher spiritual, but if it doesn't work, you've got, don't worry, the body doesn't matter. I think these are fair things. Okay. Yes, sir.
I think it's interesting how in this particular situation that he's doing here, people do that. They take truths
Yeah.
from the Bible
Yeah.
and tie them together in a way
Yeah.
that completely distorts
Yes.
what the truth was supposed
Yes.
to be.
Yes.
This is true, and this is true, and
Yes.
this is true.
Yes.
But you can't put them together and say
Right.
this is an exponential
Right.
truth.
Right. Exactly. And these folks are. Doesn't it sound good though? It sounds kind of good, doesn't it? And you know what? When people use truth to confirm their own positions or convictions by misusing truth, and it sounds good, that's where we need to be good Bereans, right? You are responsible to hold us accountable to the authority of this book. Because I'm telling you, can that kind of stuff happen at Southside Bible Church? You better believe it. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go along, some ways that can happen. So we've looked at two reasons why this is probably a statement from their letter. Third reason for seeing verse 1 as a direct quote from the Corinthian letter to Paul is that the argument, as we read these verses 2 through 5, the argument and the tone he uses in these verses support the position that he's correcting their faulty reasoning in this area rather than giving a personal positive perspective and command. And look at verse 5. Stop depriving one another. That's a heavy-duty command. We're gonna look at that. That doesn't sound like I'm telling you something I agree with, and then he comes back and hammers them. He's correcting them. He's correcting their understanding of this. Okay, so 2 through 5. But because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife. By the way, that doesn't mean go out and get married if you're not married. That means, to enjoy the intimacy in the relationship. And each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again. Purpose statement. So that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say by way of concession, not of command. So let's talk about this a little bit. By the way, the word for immoralities is the Greek word porneia, and means unlawful sexual intercourse, prostitution, unchastity, fornication. That's what immoralities is. Very bad. So I have some questions for you. I have the approved answer here, so you better answer correctly. What is Paul's basic line of argument as he corrects the Corinthian view of abstinence? What basically is he telling them? What do you think
Sexual relations are fine inside the marriage.
Very okay. They're fine. Very good.
And if you deny one another, then Satan
There
can
you
get
go.
a handhold on them.
Yeah, that's okay. It provides an opportunity for the enemy to bring sin into the marriage and that type of thing. What is the perspective that both the wife and the husband are to have toward each other? What's the perspective in here that he says you're supposed to have toward each other?
The wife's body belongs to the husband, and the husband's body belongs to the wife.
Okay. So, selfless or selfish? Selfless. You remember before the great text in Ephesians chapter 5 about marriage and wives submitting and men loving their husbands, submitting as unto the Lord, men loving their wives as Christ loves the church. In Ephesians 5:21, Paul says, be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. There's to be a selflessness in this relationship with your spouse. Selflessness. And it's seen, not any kind of heavy-handedness, but selflessness. So what's the command? we said it already. Stop depriving one another, right? Depriving, this is a strong term. It's the same verb that's used in 6, 7, and 8 with respect to one man defrauding another man. That's even a more powerful idea. Here, according to the lexicon, it means to prevent someone from having the benefit of something. So you're preventing, it's not as strong as the defrauding idea, but it's the same verb. It's a powerful command. Stop depriving one another. And we already mentioned this. Here's another good implication. And by the way, the selflessness is all. It doesn't matter whether it's this area. It doesn't have to be true throughout your marriage. Every area of your life, it's selflessness in the marriage. Here's another thought. How is the decision with respect to the exceptions to be made? What's he say in verse 5? How are you supposed to make this decision?
Agreement.
Mutual agreement, right? Mutual. That means that word for agreement means you're to be harmonious together in agreement. There's not any room for one person lording it over another. Your body belongs to me. No. This is an attitude in the marriage. And if you're going to set that aside, he says, you make a mutual agreement. Man, you know what? That's a good principle in marriage. When you're making decisions about things, by the grace of God, shouldn't you have a unity that, now, yes, you both have input into things. But I'll tell you, with Chris and I, it's been rare when I'll have it come to a decision where we're at least not together. I liken it to your marriage relationship is like a cockpit. I flew 16 years for American Airlines, and there's a captain and a co-pilot in the cockpit. And you have roles and responsibilities, and you work together to get that plane safely on the ground. But you have a captain who makes final decisions, and you have a co-pilot who puts input into those decisions. And the only time the co-pilot doesn't, takes over the airplane is if the captain's going to kill you. You don't sit there and, But point is, you work together. But if you have to have a decision, there's a head in the home and there's a helpmeet, right? That's important. And men, you serve your wives by leading, and you lead by serving her, right? They go together. As you ladies submit as unto the Lord, hopefully it's mutual. As you come to big decisions, that's important. I think that's fair. And again, verse 5, why does Paul say this? You mentioned it, to not give the enemy a foothold or an opportunity. Especially, get this, especially with respect to a practice that is not warranted, that you're doing to think you're more spiritual, but it's not warranted. So now you think what's going to give you, and here's why Garland says this. In verse 5, Paul buttresses his directive that their separation is to be short-lived. Next year we'll get back. No, we're going to pray for it. No. With a warning about Satan. He says the sexual drive is a powerful force, and Satan is a powerful adversary. Attempts at celibacy, and I would say misguided attempts at celibacy, may cause them to fall victim to the law of unintended consequences, page 4. Abstinence may not bring them closer to God as they intended, but may instead make them more vulnerable to Satan. You see? The noun lack of self-control, akrasia, refers to the unrestrained sexual impulse, and Paul worries that abstinence will make them particularly susceptible to sexual temptation. Now, sexual temptation is always there. But if you're thinking that there's something you should be doing that's not supported biblically, that just opens the door wider for you to be destroyed by the enemy, you can see why Paul is concerned. And let me say this, I mean, when you start going down these kind of paths, the enemy's involved in that. Mishandling the Word of God and preconceptions that are not necessarily hold up to biblical examination are, he's involved in that. Didn't he tempt Jesus by quoting the scriptures to him out of context? Out of context, and Jesus knew the context, and he said the context correctly to do the right thing. But the enemy's right there. He knows the word, people. So here's an implication for us, I think, page 4 there. The Corinthians had a view of spiritual maturity that equated certain activity to greater maturity. However, such thinking, whether in Corinth or today's church, can very quickly become man-centered and self-exalting, rather than selfless and Christ-exalting. I said especially attached to ideas that sound good but don't hold up to biblical examination. Right? Can we fall into the same trap as the Corinthians? Give me some examples. Boy, it's hot in here. It was hot in here last week. I don't know why. But the hot air, the volume of hot air permeating the room. I don't know. Give me some examples. Yes, ma'am.
One of the ideas that a lot of churches today have, that God is only love. God is love, and then they kind of just put everything else aside.
Okay.
Instead of showing that God is love, but he's also just. And so,
Sure.
But they skew it.
Yeah.
And so because God is love, we will accept everything and everyone.
Right.
And kind of cut parts out of the Bible.
Right. If your hermeneutic is God is love, you're going to miss some big things.
Right.
If that's how you interpret it. Right? Because God is also a God of wrath and justice and righteousness and holiness. Good. What else? Yes, sir.
Legalism. There's lots of churches that just say, if we follow these rules, if we mark these boxes, we'll be everything that we need to be. And they forget that it's obedience to the Spirit. It's the things we do, not the things we feel and are.
Okay. Are we supposed to be doing things? Yes. But what God commands us to do, clearly, correctly. You're right. Legalism is always a danger if you think you're going to mature or gain God's favor by your performance, right? Maturity brings obedience, greater obedience, doesn't it? How about just practically in the gray areas of life? I mean, I went to dinner with a dear man, and over Sunday lunch, and his boys couldn't go out and throw the football in the afternoon because we don't do that on Sundays. We just don't do that. Well, it's more spiritual not to do that. Does God prohibit that kind of stuff? No. But in his mind, that kind of restriction on a Sunday was about greater spiritual maturity. Okay, well, is it biblical? Is it right? Can that cause you to go down a path of greater problems? Maybe. What else? Man, when I was growing up, in the church back years ago in San Antonio, we had the big Christmas debate. Do you participate? Do you get a tree? Do you give gifts? All that stuff. And man, there was pretty strong undercurrent. So we didn't have a tree and we didn't give gifts, and because that's more spiritual. So we did other things, that were more spiritual, I guess, is what we were thinking. And you just have to be careful. And now when you're on that level of spiritual maturity, other people should be there. Or you start to be critical of them. Right?
So is it kind of like I guess I have a question about that. Is it kind of like Christian liberties? Are we kind of talking about those things?
Yeah, you're talking about
people dress and
yeah, we're talking about gray areas that are matters of conscience maybe, but not necessarily clearly set forth in the Bible, that we take to ourselves and then think that that is greater maturity, and then everybody should measure up to that.
Well, like if they don't do that, then they're...
Yeah, then they're kind of lesser in their maturity than you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's the Baptist idea. We don't chew or whatever, dance and go with girls who do or something. And okay, close enough.
Something like that. So, I mean, that's not a good thing to do because that can cause other issues.
Yeah, that's right, Catherine. If you go down this path, the enemy is right there to bring division and to hurt you and the body if you're not thinking clearly about the way things work, right? Now, we do our best. We have our practice papers. Better keep going. My wife would be doing this to me. Okay. Okay, I hear you, honey. I hear you. I feel the vibes. Okay, we got to keep moving. Now, let's get to this. Oh, one final point. Most commentators view 6 where he says, "But I say this by way of concession, not command." But this is referring back to the exception of not having relations. There's an exception for prayer. He said, "I say this by way of concession, not command," because he's just made his command very clear. So that's not a concession, that's a command. So the idea of taking a break, he said, "I say this." I think that's fair. In verse 7, Paul shares his heart. "Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner, another in that." So this is a transition verse. He's kind of concluding what he just said, and he's getting ready to point toward what's coming. And it might seem, when you just read that, it might seem that Paul is placing a higher spiritual value on singleness when he states, "Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am." Right? However, how does he qualify that? He makes it clear that such is not the case, because marriage or singleness lie where? In the realm of what God gives to each person for his own purpose and glory. He gives these things. This is the key. And Fee gives a paragraph on there. For at the end of that paragraph. For him, for Paul, both marriage and celibacy are gifts. And despite his own preference for his gift, he certainly does not raise it to a higher spirituality. He's not doing that. Okay? So, here's an application. What do you think is on Paul's heart when he says, "Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am"? What drives the Apostle Paul?
Christ.
What'd you say?
Christ.
You better believe it. Christ. So what is he? Why would he even say that? Because over here in verse 36, he says, "I want to promote and what's appropriate. I want to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord." Was that true of him? Was he thankful for his gift because that was his goal? What about all the great texts? What's on his heart? He has that on his heart for them. It is your devotion to Christ, your love for Christ, your passion for him, to live for him, whether you have the gift of singleness or you're married. It doesn't matter. That's what I want for you. Remember Philippians? "I regard everything as loss because of the surpassing value of knowing Christ." This is what his heart was beating. "I've suffered the loss of all things. I want to know Christ. I regard them as rubbish in order that I may gain him in Christ and be found in him with the righteousness that comes from God on the basis, not my own self-righteousness. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection, sharing his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, to attain to the resurrection of the dead." Now, I'm not there yet, but I press on, forgetting what lies behind, straining forward to what lies ahead, toward the goal of the prize of the heavenly call of God in Christ Jesus. This is Paul. This is what he wants. He's not laying down, he's not trying to lay down laws. He is trying to correct them because he doesn't want the enemy to get a foothold to hinder this devotion to Christ. Galatians 2:20. "It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Philippians 1:21. For to me to live is Christ, and dying is gain. If I'm going to stay here on this planet, it's going to mean fruitful labor for me. I'm here for your progress and joy in the faith. I want to promote Christ to you so that you have progress in your conformity to his image, your delight and joy in him, and love him more deeply. That's why you're here. Better to be with him. That's why I'm here for you and you're here for me. For my progress and joy in the faith, my relationship with Christ. So, do you get his heart? Okay, don't miss his heart. Okay. To remarry or not to remarry? Here's another thought for you in terms of the text. But I say to the unmarried and to widows, that is good for them if they remain even as I. He kind of repeats that. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. So, verse 8. And as I studied, this was interesting. When you read that, you think about it a certain way. But Paul expresses the sentiment voiced in 7. He is speaking to the unmarried and to widows. It's interesting to note that the word for unmarried is masculine. And it's used of men in 7:32. Unmarried men. This means, and I agree with this, it's very possible that Paul is speaking here about widowers and widows, not the unmarried in general and widows. There was no word in Koine Greek, the Greek of the New Testament, for widower. And this word was used in its place. And Fee explains that. He says, several items favor the suggestion that agamois should be translated widowers. First, since being widowed in antiquity created special problems for women, most cultures had a word for widows. However, they did not always have a word for the male counterpart. Greek had such a word, but it appears seldom to have been used, and never in Koine period, the period of the New Testament, in which agamos, the male idea, served in its place. Second, since throughout the entire passage Paul deals with husbands and wives mutually, it would seem to fit naturally into the total argument to see that pattern here. In other words, he singles out virgins and others who have never been married compared to those who have been married and are now unmarried for whatever reason. Okay? So, I think that's probably fair. Verse 7 then sheds light on Paul's comment about it being good for them if they remain even as I am. Okay, he says something similar in 7:39 through 40, where he talks about the same thing. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband is dead, she's free to be married to whom she wishes only in the Lord. But in my opinion, he says, she's happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I also have the Spirit of God on this. So, but here's the point. Paul would classify good. We're back to 7. In this, if this was God's gift to you, let's say your husband dies, okay, or your spouse, okay, that to remain unmarried following the death of a spouse without receiving the gift of singleness from God could be catastrophic. We're in the same boat that we were before. What does that open the door? If you say, well, my wife's dead, I'm going to remain single because that's a higher plane of spiritual maturity, and you don't have the gift of singleness, what are you setting yourself up for? The enemy to come in and just, okay, go to the prostitute then if you can't handle it. So it's good if it's God's gift. If the motive for singleness was a false sense of spiritual maturity associated with singleness, like the Corinthians, I think, believe, it opened the door to sexual sin. Hence, verse 9. But if they do not have self-control, or I think the same idea, if they do not have the gift of singleness from God, let them marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion, to sin sexually, that type of thing. Does that make sense? He's already pointed out the danger of husbands or wives depriving one another in intimacy. Verse 5, the same would be true here. I think that's fair. Does that make sense to you? Is that ringing true? Got a few minutes. What's going on? I don't know. Okay, you with me? So I think it is about widows and widowers here, the comparison, what you're going to do after that. Now, in 10 through 16, we have instruction. This is about divorce. Now, our doctrinal practice paper has a lot of stuff, and I got some of this from our paper that I put in here. So let's just look at it quickly as we come to a close here. You can look it up. How many of you been through the practices class? Some of you have. If you haven't, it'd be good to go through those. They're all online if you want to read them.
You mean the doctrinal statement?
The church practice papers.
Oh, yeah.
We have a class on that.
Yeah, I feel it.
So, here we go. But to the married I give instruction, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. Okay? This is about believers, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. Man, I don't know what the statistic is in the church, but it's like 30-40% of professing believers divorce.
Really?
Yes. The society in general is about 60%.
So the question is, does the wife sometimes divorce the husband?
Yeah, they could in Roman culture, yeah.
So it's not just...
It's not just about now, yeah, it's not just about the husband, it's about wives and husbands. So, Paul reaffirms our Lord's teaching and gives us, under inspiration of the Spirit, an additional legitimate reason for divorce and remarriage in this text, 10 through 16. Paul reiterates the Lord's teaching, states that a wife should not leave her husband and the husband should not divorce his wife. This is the same thing you see in Matthew, and that's in our practice paper. But if she does leave, what does Paul say she's supposed to do? If a Christian woman separates for whatever reason or purpose, what should she do? Reconcile or remain unmarried. And people, we've had situations we've had to deal with as a board. Some of these things are not easy to deal with, man.
Okay, but I got a question in that, because if the person is being abused, she shouldn't have...
Well, that's it. We're not going to go into all the exceptions, but we would, if there's physical abuse, I don't want to live with you, honey, but he's beating her up. No, you bring the police into it. You get the society involved and do what you're supposed to do and all those kinds of things. But, we try to be biblical in our counsel. Tim, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to the woman not to get remarried, but is that pretty much assumed to apply to both?
Yeah, it applies to both. It applies to both, the way he's kind of setting things out. Okay? So, she should remain unmarried. Okay? Believers married to non-believers. This gets where it gets a little bit more sticky. But to the rest I say, not the Lord, because the Lord didn't address that issue when he was, that if any brother, Paul's doing it under the inspiration of the Spirit, has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. Did this happen in the early church? You better believe it. Mm-hmm. Wives came to Christ, husbands didn't. Husbands came to Christ, wives didn't. Now you got a mixed marriage. One person loves Christ, the other person doesn't. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. You may want to. What a dirtbag. He can't love me like Christ loves the church. Wow. I need to get rid of this guy. Can't do it if he consents. And here's why. This is marvelous in a sense. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children are unclean, but now they are holy. There's this idea of... Read our next paragraph. In these verses, Paul tells us that a brother or sister married to an unbeliever should remain in the marriage if the unbeliever consents or agrees to live with them. The reason Paul gives is in the sense that the family is sanctified by the presence of the believer. It doesn't mean that unbelieving spouse or children are automatically saved, but rather, as one commentator, Fee, put it, from Paul's perspective, as long as the marriage is maintained, the potential for their realizing salvation remains. Why? Because you have a witness in that family to the gospel and to the truth that is not there in a lot of families. Right? A believer who's not only living out the gospel, and Peter tells women who are married to unbelieving husbands, you win him without a word by your respectful behavior You don't badger him. And God's in control of letting that man see your love for Christ as you self-sacrificially submit to him as unto the Lord. And how don't you, that may be what saves him. And I've known some dear ladies who have been in those kind of situations and stay there year after year after year, submitting to their husband. No, honey, you can't go to that fellowship thing because, and they submit.
Do they just not go?
Can I go to church? Okay. You know, you can get to a point where we must obey God rather than men, but the bottom line is, I've seen this happen. So, this is because of the constant presence of a believer who is not only living the gospel, sharing Christ's love in the family, but who also has the ability to teach the truth of the gospel from the scriptures. Isn't that great? Isn't that a gift to that family? Right? Those little ones that she's teaching. The husband who sees her life and interacts with her. Wow, people. However, verses 15 and 16, if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. And then he concludes, for how do you stay in it? You know, if they leave, they leave. But for how do you know, wife, there's two sides to this, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, a husband, whether you will save your wife? And that can be viewed, you know, I don't want you to leave, I'm going to cling to you because you might get saved by staying with me. No, I don't want anything more to do with you. You let them go. God's in control of what's going to happen and how it works itself out. You're not under bondage.
So if the unbeliever leaves, whether it be either or, then they can go?
Well, Paul says you're free. You're free from the relationship, and you're free, we will see, to remarry a believer in the Lord. If that happens, God's called us to peace. You let the person go. Trust God for that. You may love them dearly and want them to be saved, but if they walk away, you have to trust God. Paul commands the believing spouse to let the unbelieving spouse leave. Continued pursuit of the unbeliever in such circumstances is contrary to God's direction because there's no guarantee. Yes, ma'am. No guarantee that such pursuit will bring about the salvation of the departed spouse. However, here's the caveat to that. If they leave, God doesn't demand you remarry. He permits it, but he doesn't demand it. And so we put this in there. How we're waiting on God to see if he will change the heart of the departed spouse and bring about a marriage in Christ is a matter of that the abandoned spouse should commit to prayer, seeking God's guidance and direction along with wise counsel. You don't have to divorce that guy if he walks out the door. I've seen ladies do that. They remain unmarried with the hope of reconciliation, but that's in the Lord's hands. They can if they want. The believer is free in such cases to remarry a believer. So, man, we're doing good. So we're done. But we're going to keep going next week in this chapter. But I hope you walk away seeing Paul's heart. He's not laying down laws. He's not saying there's a higher form of spirituality if you're single. He's saying these are gifts from God. He's correcting their faulty view of how to be spiritual by we're not going to engage in sexual intimacy because that's more spiritual. He's correcting that because the enemy can destroy you through that false understanding of how you view spiritual maturity. And it can happen to us. Okay, any questions? You have to run to get your pew. Oh, they're still in there. I see them. They're still in there. You can't run. The class. Okay. Good. If you have any, we'll try to cover them next time. We got a lot to cover next week. Let's go ahead and pray.